Thanks so much for joining us today. We are so delighted to have you here to share in the 44th Annual Murrow Symposium and the Lifetime Achievement Awards ceremony. Creating the symposium this year was an exciting experience. In addition to our panels, our master classes, our workshops, career coaching, and keynote events, this year we also included a career expo. And this provides an additional opportunity for all of our students and employers to meet one another, establish professional relationships, and discuss potential internship and job opportunities. You know, it takes a village to make a symposium. I need to give a big thank you to our sponsors because it's all of you who help to keep this important event free for our students and the surrounding community. I also want to give a big shout out and a thank you to the Murrow Professional Advisory Board, our speakers, our students, our faculty, and our staff for sharing your energy, your expertise, and your experience with all of us. We are truly humbled by everything you all do to make this event all that it can be. You are all absolutely Murrow in action. Now, let's all silence our cell phones and turn off the flash. And that said, if you're feeling the urge to exercise your thumbs, we encourage you to do so. Please tweet and post and check in about this terrific evening. But remember, when you do, please just use the hashtag Symposium44. Now, please help me give a warm welcome to our Dean, Bruce Pinkleton.
Thank you, Corey. It's my honor to be here this evening, and thanks to each of you who have joined us here tonight. You're our guests, and we appreciate your presence. And we have a very special guest here this evening. Casey Murrow, the son of Ed and Janet Murrow, has joined us at our symposium this year. Casey, thank you for your friendship and for your support of Murrow College. We are inspired by your father's legacy every day. You want to stand and give a wave to everybody? All right, this is an exciting evening, and I'm grateful to the sponsors who make it possible. Our premier sponsors, BECU, Alaska Airlines, Inspirus Credit Union, Fox 12 Oregon, Cairo 7. Our Crimson sponsors, the Pullman Chamber of Commerce, Copacino and Fujikato, College Hill Custom Threads, Tim and Karen Pavish, Enterprise Holdings, Chateau Ste. Michelle, Kind Snacks, and our gray sponsors, KHQ Spokane, Weber Shandwick, and Crosscut. I also want to recognize all those who contribute through Cougs Give and other fundraising activities. You are part of our Dean's Circle, and I thank you for your support. With your help, the students we serve are better prepared to launch their careers and to succeed in the workplace and serve the larger purposes of our society. Thank you for your generosity. I'm also grateful to Northwest Public Broadcasting, the students of Cable 8, the Association of Women in Communications, and the Public Relations Student Society of America, and to our student club exhibitors and Murrow College staff and faculty, whose contributions are critically important to the success of Murrow College and the Murrow Symposium. I owe a particular debt of gratitude to our Energizer Bunny, Corey Wilder, and for her work planning and organizing the symposium. Yes, very well deserved. And also to Dina Penton, the head of my staff in the Dean's office, to Doug Crabiel, the head of the business office, to Sarah Stout, the head of our student services work, and to Marvin Marcello and Conley Roden. Thank you all very much for your help. After a shooter murdered 5 of their colleagues last year, journalists at the Capital Gazette in Annapolis, Maryland, worked to ensure their newspaper published the next day and continued publication without interruption. Clearly, they saw in journalism a calling to truthful storytelling and an understanding of the importance of their role in an informed society. In its role as a fourth estate, journalism serves a critical role in the health of free societies by monitoring and tempering the influence of those in power, by observing those in government, business, and other organizations, and by holding them accountable for their actions and outcomes. Journalists contribute to the flow of truthful information free societies require. Edward R. Murrow graduated from Washington State University in 1930 and did much of his important work as a journalist in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. As technology and social media continue to transform how we communicate and consume news, there's a tendency to think that Murrow's principles and work, while critical for their time, no longer matter in a modern media environment, one that provides nearly unfettered access to digital information sources and is supported by the near continual evolution of communication technology. Today, it's easy for citizens to create a personal media environment that avoids uncomfortable truths or fails to provide a full accounting of facts. But the powerful reality is this: the truth still matters. To function effectively, our society requires information based on factual accuracy and the work of journalists and other professional communicators who seek and tell the truth, as Murrow did. Ironically, Murrow's ethical courage, professional excellence, and dedication to the truth are perhaps more relevant today than at any time in our nation's history. Ultimately, understanding and using the skills and values practiced by Murrow make a difference for each of us as individuals and as larger members of our society. Those of us who have the responsibility of being professional communicators must understand and communicate the factual truth to others. This is our essential function. Those of us who teach others the craft of being professional communicators can do no better than to impart the ethical courage and resolute determination of Edward R. Murrow in seeking and telling the truth. Our mission in the Murrow College is to communicate, teach, and inspire students in keeping with the legacy of Edward R. Murrow. We do that tonight by honoring Melissa Block with a Lifetime Achievement Award for excellence in broadcast journalism. Here to present the award to Ms. Block is WSU's 11th president, Kirk Schultz. President Schultz is capably directing WSU's advancement into one of the nation's top 25 public research universities, one that offers graduate and undergraduate students innovative learning, as well as a transformative educational experience. President Schultz.
Well, good evening. It's great to see so many folks out here tonight for what is one of the seminal events that we do at WSU each year. Before I get on with the introduction of our speaker, what I'd like to do is just ask you to recognize Bruce Pinkleton, the outstanding job he's doing as the Dean of the Murrow College. Bruce, please stand and as I like to tell him, not too bad for a Michigan State grad. So anyway, for decades, Murrow College faculty have recognized and honored the achievements of journalists and professional communicators at the Murrow Symposium. Murrow Award recipients have demonstrated a commitment to the ethical standards, courage, and professional excellence exemplified by Edward R. Murrow as he reported from Buchenwald during World War II, challenged the abuses of power by Senator Joseph McCarthy, or reported on the plight of migratory farm workers in Harvest of Shame. Tonight, we honor a journalist who personifies Murrow's ethical courage and commitment to seeking and telling the truth by presenting Melissa Block with the 2019 Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. Yes, go ahead. Let's applaud once again. Ms. Block began her career at NPR in 1985 as an editorial assistant for All Things Considered and rose through the ranks to become the program's senior producer. Her reporting has taken her throughout our country and world, resulting in numerous awards for the quality of her work. Many of us know her outstanding work as a reporter and correspondent in New York from 1994 to 2002, and as co-host of All Things Considered from 2003 to 2015. The Overseas Press Club of America cited Ms. Block's reporting on rape as a weapon of war in Kosovo and awarding the NPR the Lowell Thomas Award in 1999, and her reporting following the September 11th attacks in New York helped NPR earn a George Foster Peabody Award. Her reporting from China's Sichuan province during and after its massive earthquake in 2008 brought the tragedy to life for audiences around the world. At the moment the earthquake hit, Ms. Block had the presence of mind to record a real-time narration of the seismic upheaval she was witnessing. Her reporting from this tragedy, including the story of parents desperately looking for their toddler son and his grandparents, received attention from across the globe. Judges singled out this poignant work in awarding NPR's earthquake coverage a George Foster Peabody Award. This reporting also received a DuPont Columbia Award, a National Headliner Award, and the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award, among other recognitions. If you listen to Ms. Block's reporting from the scene of the 2008 earthquake and to Murrow's most critical reporting from World War II, you hear striking similarities: a gritty determination to get the story, gripping reporting, and a striking sense of raw emotion balanced with fact-based storytelling. As a leader at NPR and a longtime host of All Things Considered, Ms. Block has eloquently covered the most pressing issues of our day, contributing to our national dialogue and many of the most polarizing issues we face. She has done so without bias or vitriol, demonstrating an unwavering commitment to the truth. Now, as a special correspondent, Ms. Block continues to report on issues of critical importance in a way that inspires confidence and trust. How appropriate that we recognize her when the symposium's theme is storytelling for impact. So if Bruce, you'll join me up on the stage with Ms. Block. In recognition of the decades of incisive reporting that has earned her journalism's highest honors and has made her one of NPR's most trusted, familiar, and beloved voices, we are honored to present Melissa Block with the Edward R Murrow College of Communication Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. Please join me in congratulating Melissa Block.
Thank you all so much. This is a huge honor, and when I was talking to Dean Pinkleton about what I would talk about, he said, you know, you could get up there and tap dance, and they would be happy. And I thought about that, actually, but decided we might all be better off if that didn't happen. Thank you, President Schultz, for that wonderful introduction, and to Dean Pinkleton for everything you've done to make me feel so at home here. And also, I'm so honored to be able to meet Casey Murrow. Thank you for coming. There is something about learning that you're receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award that I have to say inspires a dose of some pretty serious introspection. And I have to confess my immediate reaction was one of outright alarm, because I thought, you know, Lifetime Achievement? Does this mean I'm done? Can I retire? Is it over? That burst of trepidation, though, was followed soon after by my second reaction, which was, how can I possibly be getting a Lifetime Achievement Award when I feel like just now I am finally, after 34 years, figuring out kind of how to do this radio thing? And of course, my angst was not helped when I made the fatal mistake of looking at the list of past recipients of the Murrow Award. All those great men of singular names, Cronkite, Shore, Jennings, Koppel, and eventually with a sprinkling of Amanpours and Woodruffs thrown in. And of course, my NPR colleagues, Robert Siegel and Deborah Amos, who have taught me so much over the years. At any rate, my alarm and distress are now overwhelmed by my deep gratitude and joy at being in the company of so many journalists whose work I've admired for decades. So above all, thank you. This is a terrific honor. And of course, to be getting an award named for Edward R. Murrow at the College of Communication that bears his name is a truly humbling thing. One side benefit of receiving this award is that it's given me reason to listen back to Edward R. Murrow's riveting broadcasts from World War II, also to watch his See It Now evisceration of Senator Joseph McCarthy from 1954, and his 1960 documentary on the plight of migrant workers, Harvest of Shame, which we heard about earlier. As gripping and groundbreaking as Murrow's television work is, to me it is his radio work that reinforces so clearly just how powerful and intimate this medium that I love can be when in the right hands and the right voice. How radio lends itself so beautifully to language and metaphor and engages the listener in active imagination. Go back and listen to Murrow's famous broadcast from London in December 1943. He's just returned from flying on a Royal Air Force bombing run, part of the whole great aerial armada hurtling toward Berlin, as he put it. It was one of the heaviest attacks of the war. He'll be flying on a black four-motored Lancaster fighter plane named D-Dog with Jock Abercrombie in the pilot's seat. But before they take off, Murrow takes his time with detail. He notes the thermos bottle of coffee, chewing gum, an orange, and a bit of chocolate that are delivered to each man of the crew. And who else might notice this in the throes of pre-flight anxiety? He describes a lone hawk hovering over the airfield, absolutely still as he faced into the wind. I certainly will not pretend to imitate Murrow's delivery. That would be a fool's errand indeed, but just listen to how he uses language, his powers of description, as he paints the picture of the bombing run for Americans glued to their radios back home. When D-Dog is illuminated by the cone of a German searchlight and Jock, the pilot, sends the plane into a corkscrew, Murrow says, "I could see his fingernails turn white as he gripped the wheel." And looking down, he begins to glimpse what is happening to Berlin. He says, "The small incendiaries were going down like a fistful of white rice thrown on a piece of black velvet. As Jock hauled the dog up again, he says, I was thrown to the other side of the cockpit, and there below were more incendiaries, glowing white and then turning red. The cookies, the 4,000-pound high explosives, were bursting below like great sunflowers gone mad." Later, he says, "I looked down, and the white fires had turned red. They were beginning to merge and spread, just like butter does on a hot plate." And humor me with just a bit more, because it's hard to stop. He says, "Again, D-Dog dove, climbed, and twisted, and was finally free. He flew level then. I looked on the port beam at the target area. There was a red, sullen, obscene glare. The fires seemed to have found each other, and we were heading home." It later turned out that two of the journalists who flew on different planes on that bombing run that night never made it home. Murrow famously concludes, Berlin was a kind of orchestrated hell, a terrible symphony of light and flame. When he broadcast live from London rooftops during the Blitz, or when he recorded the sound of footsteps as Londoners made their way to bomb shelters like ghosts with steel shoes, as he put it, those word pictures made the war thousands of miles away visceral to Americans. In 1941, the poet Archibald MacLeish paid tribute to Murrow at a banquet in New York and addressed him this way: "You burned the city of London in our houses, and we felt the flames that burned it. You laid the dead of London at our doors, and we knew the dead were our dead." What lessons can we take from that? Murrow's work points to the power of journalism, not just to illuminate truth, but to foster empathy, to make the world a tighter, more connected place, to bring the stories of others and make us feel they're our own. And that, I think, at its heart, is what motivates many of us who do what we do. As NPR founding mother Susan Stamberg once put it, "I'm catching stories with my microphone, a magic wand waved against silence." My own journey into this world is really quite accidental. Growing up, I never thought I would be a reporter. I'm not sure it would have occurred to me that that was something that I could do. No one in my family was a journalist. We didn't have feisty debates about the news of the day around the dining room table. And I was not part of that burgeoning group of young people who were weaned on a steady, nutritious diet of National Public Radio in the backseat of the family car. But as I look back, I do remember an aha moment, and I think many journalists have their own version of this, the moment when you first realize the power of what reporting can do. And for me, that moment came in high school when I read the book A Time to Die by the New York Times reporter and columnist Tom Wicker about the Attica prison riot of 1971. Inmates at Attica had taken dozens of prison staff hostage, and Wicker was summoned by the prisoners to be an observer and mediator inside the prison during the 4-day standoff. In the end, after several days of negotiation, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller called it off and ordered troopers to retake the prison by force. State police opened fire, and it was a bloodbath. 39 people died, 29 of them inmates, but also 10 of the prison staff who had been taken hostage. State officials claimed the guards had been killed by the prisoners, their throats slit, but it was later proved that in fact they were killed by police bullets in a barrage of indiscriminate gunfire, killed by the troopers who had been sent in to storm the prison and save them. Tom Wicker was there in Attica to document what he saw during the assault and the brutal treatment of prisoners afterward, and his reporting stood the narrative of who killed whom on its head. Several years later, talking to Studs Terkel about his reporting from Attica, Wicker said, "I felt my professional objectivity or standing, the professional processes I'd been trained in. There comes a time in everyone's life when that sort of thing has to stand aside for the human considerations involved." The human considerations involved. I'm quite sure when I read A Time to Die that I harbored no illusions that I would follow in Wicker's footsteps. I'm not even sure how his book landed in my hands. But I do remember quite clearly how it opened my eyes to the possibility of what journalists could do, how important it was to be present, to bear witness, to expose abuses and hard truths, and to tell stories in such a compelling way that they will stay with you years or decades later. When I walked through the doors at NPR for my first day of work in January 1985, I walked into a place that would end up becoming my work home for 34 years. At the time, NPR was a much smaller and scrappier organization than it is now. We had a grand total of 1 full-time foreign correspondent on staff based in London. We now have 17 bureaus around the world, from Manila to Dakar, from Moscow to Rio. Our domestic staff has expanded, our audience has grown exponentially, and of course, back in 1985, the notion that you would be able to hear our broadcasts whenever you choose on a device so small you can keep it in your pocket, or on a smart speaker that you shout commands at, that would have felt like the stuff of absurd fantasy. I had no background in radio journalism when I started at NPR, but I quickly discovered that I loved fiddling around with tape and loved putting the pieces of the audio puzzle together. I loved working with sound. I loved coming into work every day knowing that I would learn new things about our country and the world, about science and politics, music and literature. I had the privilege of learning from All Things Considered hosts Susan Stamberg, who showed me what empathy sounded like on the radio, and from Noah Adams, who showed me the virtues of eloquent economy in writing, and he probably would have me take out that adjective right there, and who showed me how an interview should always sound like a true conversation. I worked with audio engineers who took great pride in crafting the highest quality recordings possible to fully immerse listeners in the audio experience and transport them to the places we had been. So when I started reporting on my own about a decade after I started, I brought with me all of their wisdom and put it to use. And what I've tried to do in the years since, really what all reporters do, I think, is a pretty basic fundamental thing. I want to take you with me, to bring you inside the clinic in rural Mozambique, where a pregnant woman is finding out that she's HIV positive, or to the ruins of that apartment building in China we heard about after an earthquake, where a young couple is desperately searching for their toddler son. Or maybe I'm bringing you to the icy track where an Olympic athlete is about to careen headfirst, face down on a sled at speeds of 90 miles an hour. I want to bring the listener there with me to all these places, not just for the visceral experience or sometimes the thrill of it, though I do hope there's some of that too. In fact, sometimes when I'm out there reporting, I think of my mom and dad, who are 89 and 90 years old. They won't ever get to see the places I go, but I can bring those experiences to them and try to make them feel like they were there, living vicariously through the radio. So that's one goal, but also I'm hoping to get you to see life from someone else's perspective. If I do my job right, you will be transported somewhere, you will listen actively, and you will understand someone else's life just a bit more, what drives them, or maybe terrifies them, why they live where they live, what they're passionate about, what troubles them, or maybe gives them joy. An NPR colleague once told me, reporters have a skeleton key to the world, and it's true. We're really lucky. We get to go to fascinating places and ask nosy questions, and almost always people trust us with the gift of their stories. Almost always. Of course, as we all know, we are living in a time when there is widespread distrust of the media, when facts are seen as fungible and fluid. We're having to figure out how to cover a president who, according to the latest tally by the Washington Post's fact checker, has made 9,451 false or misleading claims in 801 days. It's about 12 untruths a day. And as journalists, we find ourselves wrestling with precisely what to call that. Do we call these incorrect statements by the president lies or falsehoods? And if we try to truth squad these claims to refute the falsehoods, we might bear in mind what some social science research has shown, that doing so may instead have the opposite unintended effect. It's known as the backfire effect, the notion that people's faith in mistaken beliefs is strengthened even when presented with factual corrections. In other words, providing corrective information actually can make the misinformation more potent. By repeating the false claim in order to disprove it, we end up simply propagating and reinforcing the original falsehood. Another separate and also daunting finding, this one from researchers at Duke University, that exposure to contrary opinions on Twitter didn't make people more open to opposing views. It just increased polarization. And yes, we are living in a time when the press is routinely and constantly condemned by the president. Of course, there is ample precedent for media bashing from the White House. In 1970, it was Vice President Spiro Agnew who famously snarked about the media, calling them the nattering nabobs of negativism. In words penned by speechwriter and evident alliteration lover William Safire, Agnew went on, "They have formed their own 4-H club, the hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history." From there, we've moved on to the latest iteration, with President Trump labeling media as the enemy of the American people, out of control, crazed lunatics, traffickers in fake news. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. These words are not just an insult to our profession. These words have power, they are toxic, and they spread like a virus. Look at what other leaders that we see now dismissing unflattering media reports as fake news. It's autocrats, leaders of repressive regimes from Syria to Venezuela to China, Myanmar, the Philippines, Brazil. They're all taking up the cry fake news and brandishing it like a weapon to discredit and crack down on the press. And yes, we see this idea spreading more and more here at home. I was deeply disturbed when I saw a recent public opinion poll conducted by Quinnipiac University. One question was this: people were asked which of these represents their point of view. 1, the news media is the enemy of the people, or 2, the news media is an important part of democracy. The good news, I suppose, is that overall 69% of voters went with an important part of democracy, 21% chose enemy of the people, but among Republicans polled, 47% said the news media is the enemy of the people. Just 31% said it was part of democracy. Think about that. And then think about the man who was filmed at the end of one of President Trump's recent rallies, screaming at the reporters there and calling them degenerate filth. What can we conclude from this? It is a sobering prospect and one we should all reckon with. I am choosing to believe that facts still matter, that truth is not subject to debate, that the term fake news is an abhorrent construct, that the legacy built by Edward R. Murrow still stands for something very, very important. And I think about the legacy left to us by the journalists who have died in the course of their work, or who in some cases were deliberately targeted because of their work. Jamal Khashoggi, Murray Colvin, Anthony Shadid, Chris Hondros, Tim Hetherington. Bruce mentioned the reporters at the Capital Gazette who were targeted, so many more. And I think in particular about NPR's supremely talented photojournalist named David Gilkey. David was on assignment for NPR in Afghanistan in June of 2016. He and our African interpreter, Zabihullah Tamana, were traveling with an Afghan army unit when that convoy came under fire, and David and Zabi were both killed. David was able to turn NPR's radio journalism into visual journalism online that packed an incredible punch. What we aspire to do with sound, to create a deep, personal, intimate window into a story, David was always able to capture with his camera. Look at his photographs from Iraq and Afghanistan, from the depths of the Ebola epidemic in Africa, from the earthquake in Haiti. Look at the faces he captured in times of war, in moments of despair, and sometimes joy. And you immediately know there is a man of great heart behind the lens. The camera that David was carrying on the day he died is preserved now, battered and dusty, in a case in NPR's lobby in Washington, D.C. And above that camera, printed on the wall, is something that David once said to explain his hopes for what his work could do. It's not just reporting, he said. It's not just taking pictures. It's, do the visuals, do the stories, do they change somebody's mind enough to take action? So if we're doing our part, it gets people to do their part. And then he added, hopefully. I think about that when I walk by that camera. I think about the terrible price that David and Zabi paid for their devotion. And I really, really hope that what David was hopeful about is true, that our work, the telling of stories that matter, that it does create change, that it inspires people to take action, to do their part. That sense of mission is actually built into NPR's DNA. In the mission statement that was written by one of the network's original founders, Bill Siemering, back in 1970. I've been lucky enough to get to know Bill over the years, and I keep some of his words pinned above my desk as a kind of touchstone. Stop for a minute and just think about how revolutionary this idea was back then in 1970 and how inspiring it still is now. Bill wrote, "National Public Radio will not regard its audience as a market or in terms of its disposable income, but as curious, complex individuals who are looking for some understanding, meaning, and joy in the human experience." And Bill was always thinking about the listener, who he said should rely on NPR as a source of information of consequence. What the listener hears, he said, should make a difference in his attitude toward his environment and himself, or herself. Making a difference, changing how people see the world, shaking them out of what they know, maybe rattling their comfort zone. Ideas which bring me back full circle to Edward R. Murrow, and I'm probably not the first person on this stage to quote from him liberally. In a speech to the Radio and TV News Directors Association in 1958, Murrow sounded a strong alarm about the future of radio and television news. He was deeply concerned about timidity, about executives' fear of offending, and about the commodification of programming. Television had been turned into a money-making proposition, he said, a money-making machine, a medium being used to distract, delude, amuse, and insulate us rather than enlighten. In the end, Murrow told the broadcasters, this instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and even it can inspire, but it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, he said, it's nothing but wires and lights in a box. I am quite sure that the people in this room and at this college are committed to making those wires and lights have a true purpose that goes well beyond entertainment, that enlightens. And I am deeply honored to accept this award that celebrates that fine tradition. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. campaign just a few weeks before the election, and I was in Hannibal, Missouri, talking to a Mark Twain impersonator on a riverboat, of course, as one does in Hannibal, Missouri. And there was a lovely older couple there who were about to renew their marriage vows on a riverboat by the Mark Twain impersonator. And I just was asking them about, the election and how they were feeling, and they started saying, that Obama guy, I don't know. They said, I said, what are you worried about? And they said, well, he wants to change the national anthem to I want to teach the world to sing. And they were a lovely couple, and I said, really? I said, where did you hear that? And she said, oh, I saw it on Facebook. And what do you do about that? I mean, I could have spent a lot of time arguing with them and trying to convince them that actually that was not going to happen, and maybe they should check their sources. But it was just emblematic to me of just, people are very susceptible, obviously. And I think the best remedy, the best medicine is for us to do our jobs as well as we can and to keep reinforcing reality. And I think there are many discussions to be had about how we cover inaccurate statements. And I think we see a real problem with this, especially in shorthand, in headlines, in tweets that repeat something verbatim without any qualification. And that is another way of propagating misinformation that I'm really concerned about.
Let me ask you a follow-up. Do you believe journalists are obligated to tell all sides of a story, even if some of those sides are clearly specious or emanate from rumor or unfounded, quote-unquote science, that
No.
kind of a thing?
No,
Okay.
I don't.
Would you care to expand a little
Well,
bit on
yeah.
on that answer?
Flat earthers, I think we can safely say, do not need to be given the time of day. I mean, I think the best example would be climate change, and I think we should accept at this point that man-made climate change is an accepted fact. I don't see any. I don't know that we need to spend a whole lot of time arguing the merits of that argument. I really don't. When an overwhelming preponderance of scientific evidence shows that is exactly what's happening, and we see communities responding to it all the time.
Do you feel a need to balance various viewpoints then when you're
What's
reporting?
that?
Do you feel a need to balance various viewpoints when you're reporting on these
Sure,
stories?
on other stories, absolutely. I mean, I'm picking extremes,
Sure.
obviously, but no, of course. I mean, 99% of what we talk about would be represented by a range of views, and I think anytime I'm doing a story that doesn't reflect that, I haven't done my job. So I'm working on a story now about a town on the Arizona-Mexico border where some militia groups have come from out of state and are trying to patrol the border on their own. And it was important to me to get people in town also who live there who also share some of those views that the border is porous and open and that we don't know who's coming across. At the same time, there's a strong sense of folks in the community who welcome people coming across, and somebody called them actually international entrepreneurs, which I thought was an interesting coinage. So anyway, but point being that I for all of us to do our jobs well and for people to take us seriously and to believe in what we do, if we're telling one side of the story, that serves no one.
Okay, very good, outstanding.
Unless it has to do with the flat earth.
Very good. So, as you know, as I've mentioned, I really enjoy you conducting an interview. I'm curious how you prepare for an interview. We have a lot of students here tonight, and so that process of preparation is important. How do you usually prepare?
I probably over-prepare. I'm a big proponent of reading more than you could possibly ever really need to read, but you never know sort of when buried somewhere years back in a clip, you might just find the germ of an idea that you want to follow up on. So I try to read as much as I can. If it's somebody that I'm profiling, I try to read other interviews they've done. That drawback there, though, is that you don't want to be so, you don't want to have other people's conversations in your head, right? You want it to be fresh. And the one benefit of seeing other interviews is you may know, okay, this is something this person has said 50 times, and I'm going to ask them something else because I don't want them to be just repeating the same thing they told other people. But there's no substitute for preparation. And we talked about this at the panel today for your students, that my job is to be as prepared as I possibly can going in, and then to be able to let the conversation flow, right? So that I'm not thinking about the things that I've read, but they have sort of impregnated themselves in the way that I'm thinking or how I'm approaching a subject, and that it sort of is the background, the foundation of the questions that I'm asking. So that would be one way. And then the rest of it is, part of the interviewing process is just trying to set people at ease. I mean, it's an awkward thing for a lot of people to be doing an interview. I think radio has the advantage of being relatively unobtrusive. I mean, we're not there with a big camera, and I think a lot of people, and myself included, are not real excited to be in front of a camera, but microphone's pretty low tech and low key, and we can be small. And the important thing is to just establish enough of a rapport that it doesn't feel like an interview, like I was mentioning especially with Noah Adams, that you shouldn't be looking at questions, you should just be able to have a conversation, and that is the thing that puts people at ease.
All right, outstanding. Here's a hard question. Do you recall an interview with someone when they said something that surprised you, you weren't expecting, something that might have been particularly self-revealing or perhaps out of character?
I think that happens all the time. I mean, the best part of doing my job is that it's always surprising. So I love that part of it. And I think if I have preconceptions going in of what somebody might say, that's also sort of not fun, right? I mean, the fun part is the discovery. And maybe the best part is when somebody sort of realizes that they're saying something or thinking about something that they haven't thought of before. I mean, as an interviewer, that is incredibly rewarding. If I hear, sometimes it might be a musician and a publicist is listening in and they're like, wow, I never heard him or her talk about that before. Or for a guest to say, I haven't thought about that before, but now I'm thinking about it. I'm trying to think of some other examples. Sometimes it's just the little things. I did, when I was a reporter in New York, I got kind of obsessed with baseball, thanks to Robert Siegel, actually, which is a separate story. But he turned me into a Yankee fan. And we're both lapsed Yankee fans now, I think. But I got really obsessed with umpires. And there was one umpire who did a lot of Yankee games named Jim Joyce, who had an incredibly loud strike call. You would listen to it and you'd be like, oh my God, who was that guy? So I did a piece about him and a bunch of other umpires, and I asked him whether, sometimes you just have to be able to ask sort of the naive, dumb question. And I asked him if umpires practice in front of a mirror. And he said they do.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. He said, because that's such a physical thing, and they're selling a call, and he's like, yeah, I'll practice, If it's a bang-bang play, I want to be able to sell that call, and so there you go.
Well, that is surprising, as a matter of fact.
And wouldn't you?
Yeah,
I would
totally.
Practice,
yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Maybe I need to practice more, who can tell, so. Good. Well, you mentioned putting people at ease. How do you do that? I mean, do you think about that? Is it just part of a conversation? It's a skill, perhaps, that I don't know a lot of people, have at their disposal.
Well, I'm sure I'm better at it now than I was when I started. Sure. And again, it's just, sometimes when it's not working and when I can tell someone is just nervous or looking at notes, or sometimes I will stop and just say, I feel like you're a little nervous. Why don't you just take a breath? We're just having a conversation. Just, we're just talking. And usually it works. I mean, it's, maybe you're calling more attention to it by saying, you sound kind of nervous. But I think it's in how you approach things. And I think if you're writing questions down verbatim and looking at a piece of paper, nobody's going to be relaxed. I mean, I wouldn't be. And I think you just have to sort of connect with people, just like any other interaction. It's just about being human and just trying to find the common ground that will bind you together. And that's the fun part.
Outstanding, outstanding. Our students wanted to know, how do you convince someone that you're trustworthy as a journalist, especially if they're concerned about this notion of the media or, with this environment of fake news in which we operate? Do you run into resistance there? What?
Sometimes. One of the students asked me this afternoon, too. I think, honestly, we're often helped by the fact that we're NPR, and I think we just have sort of a built-in baseline level of trust among, not everybody, but a lot of people, and they know and respect the local stations that are in their communities and serving the communities so well. So that helps. It does open doors, I think, a lot of the time. And other times, if I feel like there's resistance, I'll usually try to ask, what is it that worries you? What are you concerned about? And maybe they've been taken out of context before, misquoted. This actually happened in the Arizona trip. And I wasn't going to try to convince this particular guy that I was not going to do that. I mean, he'd had a bad experience and he'd been burned, and I can respect that. And sometimes I would say, I just think it's really important that your view get represented in our story. It would be a shame if what you're thinking, your way of thinking is not part of my piece. It's really important to me. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think, spending time with people too helps, not just sort of, I have 5 minutes, can you talk to me? It's, let's go talk for an hour and see what happens.
Right,
so
okay, outstanding.
Sticking around can help.
Good, good. Students were also interested in how do you handle criticism from sources and also from the public? Do you pay attention
I
to
cry. I do pay attention to it because I think it makes me better if I know where I've messed up. Sometimes you sort of think, would I feel comfortable if the people in this story were listening to it with me in the room, right? Would they recognize themselves? Even if it may be, a critical piece, if they would feel like they had a chance to say what they wanted to say, or would they be looking at it as if it were some sort of funhouse mirror? I think anybody who's had people do stories about them in the room can think, like, they look at them and they go, that wasn't at all what I said, or they got that totally wrong. So I get that. I think the criticism keeps us honest. And one thing I miss is that All Things Considered used to run on air a letter segment every week with feedback from listeners. I mean, I used to actually be the one who opened the mail when we actually had physical letters, and I miss that because I feel like that was so important to have. And it wasn't always positive. A lot of it was critical, and I think just to have that exchange. I mean, it's part of what I was talking about with Bill Seymour's mission. It was also supposed to be so interconnected and really feel like the community was part of what we were doing. And I do worry that we've lost that a bit. I take a lot of criticism to heart. Maybe too much. I mean, sometimes stuff can really, gnaw at you for a while. But I think it's super important.
Interesting. Good. Do you feel like it makes you a better reporter?
Absolutely. Yeah. Unless you get it it's too much in your head that you can't function, and that's never any good.
Sure. Okay. Outstanding. How do you find and develop story ideas? So, we're in a small town, and we've been emphasizing rural journalism here, and it's interesting because there's a tendency, I think, sometimes to disavow the importance of rural journalism, and yet as you look at a lot of the issues our country's facing, many of these issues of race, as an example, and politics certainly cut among rural-urban divide. So students are interested. How do you develop stories? What are you looking for? What's the process you go through there?
Yeah, it depends so much on each individual story. So it might be, a lot of the stories that I do are character-driven, so I'm looking sort of very narrow focus. It might not be a big explanatory journalism piece about the roots of the opioid crisis, but I very much am interested in, as I did a couple of years ago, finding a family who had been confronting this and spending some time talking about what that process had been like for them with their son and his many visits in and out of rehab, or how the crisis sort of spirals out within a small community to the coroner and the high school principal who's had a kid overdose in first period class. So I approach it sort of, I tend to take a bigger idea and narrow it down. Not everybody works that way, and it's not right for everybody, but I always prefer being able to spend more time with fewer people. And in terms of finding ideas, I think, sometimes it's a matter of just calling people and saying, what is the story that you think is really important that's not being covered? So if it's, a rural issue, maybe you have groups that are in the community, and chances are there's something that's really important to them that's on their mind, and especially with the demise of so much local journalism and local newspapers, chances are those stories are not getting covered. Right. And so it's a matter of cultivating sources and being able to go to them and say, I'm interested in X, I want you to keep me in mind. If you have stories that you think are important that we're not covering, please let me know. And some of it is just serendipity, some of it is just especially if you're in a city, walking down the street and seeing something that just piques your curiosity or just something you're wondering about. I'm always curious about language, so I tend to gravitate toward language stories if I'm in other countries. I like to do just sort of little explainers about lingo. Follow your passions, I guess, would be the other part of that, and then learn how to sell those stories to your corporate overlords.
Fair enough. Your story regarding the earthquake devastation in China, I suppose the gravity of that story and the reporting will follow you for the rest of your life. I hope you don't get tired of talking about it because, you know, as I prepared for your visit and was doing some of my own research, I found that piece. It's just about 12 minutes. I was sitting in my office late one night alone. I just could not stop listening to that story. I mean, you want to stop it, and you know where the outcome is going with that story. And if you're a parent especially, it just grabs you, basically. And, you know, when your story was done, I just had to pause and take a deep breath. It's such a remarkable personal story. I'm curious, and the students want to know, how do those stories affect you personally? That's a remarkable story.
That was, yeah. I mean, and for folks who haven't heard it, this was, when we saw some of the pictures earlier, this was a couple days after the Sichuan earthquake. We happened to be there when the earthquake hit, and it was devastating, about 90,000 people killed.
Right.
A lot of them in schools, school children
Right.
in schools that were terribly constructed. And in this case, we happened to find the couple, and you saw me riding in the car with
Right.
them. Their son, who wasn't quite 2 years old, was home with his grandparents. Mom had gone to work. They were, and dad, they were. We were driving down the street of a city that had been really badly devastated, and they were clinging to the side of an excavator. It was like they were trying to physically pull the excavator down the street. And our interpreter, in talking to them, found out that they had been waiting for, I think at that point, 3 days for heavy equipment to get to their building, which had completely collapsed. They knew their son and his grandparents were inside, and they had had no help. So they finally had an excavator. They were willing it to come to their place. And then it was one of those stories, and when I say I like to narrow the frame, I mean, originally we thought we'll go to the city and we'll bounce around and we'll talk to people and we'll paint a picture of the city. And it became so clear to me in following them that we would just stay with them for the day. I mean, I couldn't leave them. I wanted to know what happened. And they were gracious enough, and it's really astounding to me still, to allow us to stay with them for that day. And I give a lot of credit to our interpreter. I was mentioning this earlier, Philip He, who was Chinese, and was able, he was our ambassador, really. He was our emissary to explain to people who were in a horrible point in their life and in a country that had a lot of distrust of Western media, to explain to them who we were and that we wanted to tell their story and would it be okay if we stayed. And they allowed us to just basically witness the course of their day. We were with them for 9 hours, and it was extraordinary. And I remember part of what is different in that story from any other story I've ever done is that I was basically narrating the script on site, and
Yeah.
I'm extremely emotional. I mean, you can't escape it. It was a really, really wrenching thing to witness over the course of the day. And what still amazes me is that at the end of the day, after they finally have found out that their son and his grandparents have died, and we left them, our interpreter got an email from them about an hour after we left, thanking us for having been there.
Wow.
Which is just blows my mind.
That's
But the answer to your question,
Yeah.
which was how does it affect me?
Yeah.
I don't know that I listened to that piece for a really long time, and I still have a really hard time listening to it. When we filed it, it was about 12 minutes, and I remember telling our show editor, you know, it may be just too much, it may be just really over the top, and if you need to cut it, please just cut it, because I don't want to turn people off if it's just too wrenching, and they ran it in its entirety. But it is a really hard thing for me to listen to, and I think about that day. I mean, there are visceral senses that come back to me. I mean,
Right.
as you said, we had experienced the earthquake. We happened to be there when the earthquake hit, and if you've never been in an earthquake, which I hadn't been, and this was a really strong one, it's a horrifying feeling. And that muscle memory of having the earth move under your feet it stays with me still. I remember being on a miniature golf course of all things. I think it was the summer after that, and there was a water wheel that had a motor under it to keep the water going, and the ground was shaking, and it was really scary for me, even though it was in the most absurdly, benign place. But being with people at moments like that and seeing what we saw, so many of the people who died were children. I had a young daughter at that point, and it was just impossible for me to disconnect that from my own personal experience. The mom in the story that you talked about told us that when she went to work that day, her son had said, "Please take me with you." And I remember her telling me that, and it was just like a knife in my heart. So do they stay with me? Absolutely. And that one more than any other story. I have a hard time listening to it now, and it's been 11 years.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It's really gripping reporting, truthfully. It's
Well, all credit to them for letting us be there.
yeah,
So.
yeah, it's interesting. Well, I could talk about that for a long time. Let's move on. I'm sorry. You did a series with NPR called Our Land, which took you across America, from Alaska to the Mississippi Delta. And once again, it kind of reminded me of our students, actually, of the rural reporting project that they're working on. And so they wanted to know if the reporting that you did and the reporting that we see in America, or in the news rather, if that reflects the America that we are, basically. In other words, they really wanted to know, are media doing a good job of covering America, basically, in your mind?
Well, I mean, there's so many different types and avenues of media. It's hard to lump them all in together. I mean, I think we could certainly do a lot better. And again, the question of what's happened to local newspapers and local reporting and the shrinkage that we've seen is really, really disturbing. I mean, I do think that NPR, better than most, because we have this incredibly vibrant network of public radio stations like Northwest Public Broadcasting and the network here all over the country, embeds us in places that most news organizations would never hear about. Right. But I do think that, you know, all media, and especially in the last couple of years, are so Washington focused and so intently driven by the news of the day out of Washington, which, while it's not unimportant, I think we've heard over and over again that that's not what's most on people's minds. And they're interested in it to the extent that it affects them. So there might be a really interesting story to do about healthcare, but it may not be coming out of the Health and Human Services Department in Washington. It may be coming out of your local community. And what I loved about doing the Our Land series is that I originally thought it was a series that was born soon after the 2016 election, and I thought, well, I should do a road trip and I should talk about politics and where we are. And I just started, when I started thinking about it more and more, A, I don't particularly like political stories, and B, I sort of felt like everybody was so fed up with talking about politics that there was probably something more interesting to talk about. And this was much more about the things I talked about before, about community, about why people live where they live, what shapes them, what it is about their identity that hinges on where they're from. And they turned into little portraits of places and people that maybe reflect something about the national conversation, but that were not about, did you vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton and why? And I think part of what I liked, especially we did a number of stories from Southeast Alaska. I'm always looking for any reason to go report from Alaska because it's a fascinating place. And one of the things that made me happiest afterward was that Alaskans wrote to say, you know, thank you for not treating us like a caricature, that we recognize ourselves in your stories. And so many people come up and report about us like we're freaks, and you sort of captured who we are. And to me, that sort of is a no-brainer. Like, of course, why would I treat you like freaks? But it just makes you realize how distorted a view we may be getting of places around the country and how people feel misrepresented.
Sure.
So that told me something.
Sure.
And I think we could all do better in terms of that.
Okay, well, you know, we're just about out of time, but I just have to ask you a follow-up. I'm curious, when you went to do those stories, if you're doing portraits of people, what was, you know, how do you discover a portrait of a person? In other words, what if you're in Southeast Alaska, is this something you're looking for that's unusual? Do you go with someone in mind, a story in mind, a general idea? What's the process there?
Yeah, well, that one was interesting. I mean, some of them were really random. I am a fanatic reader of maps. I just love looking at maps, and I was looking at the map of Southeast Alaska, and I said, why is that place called Myers Chuck? That's such a cool name. And I thought maybe there was this guy named Myers Chuck, and it turned out there wasn't a guy named Myers Chuck, but I found a little video. I know. Sometimes the dead ends lead you someplace else that's interesting. And I found a video of a person on their boat heading into Myers Chuck. It's a tiny, 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 tiny little place. And there was a post office there. And the zip code is 99903, which it just has this great sort of end of the earth feel to it. And I came from a tiny town, and like the post office was sort of the only place you could go. And I thought, well, that's probably really interesting. And then I asked somebody, you know, who runs the post office? And they're like, oh, wow, Cassie Peavy. She's been there forever. She and her husband, Steve. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. So we flew in on the mail plane. It comes once a week. We flew in on a float plane, landed, spent the day with Cassie in the post office as she sorted the mail. And it's just a magical place, and finding people like that, you know, it's not just that they're interesting in themselves, although they are, but it ended up speaking to something bigger, which is, you know, they're older. Her husband, Steve, has had a stroke, and even though he still goes out fishing by himself with one workable arm, which is amazing to me, you know, what's it like to grow old in a place with no health care, and where any visit to a hospital is going to involve maybe 1, maybe 2 flights? Can you live where you really want to live, or do you move? And do you move to be closer to your grandchildren? So it spoke to something bigger through the lens of this really fascinating couple. So that was, you know, sometimes things just happen that way. Other times it may be that I've heard about somebody who's interesting, or I know there's an issue, like closing of a hospital in a small town in Kansas. So they come in all different ways, and that's what makes it so exciting, because you just sort of never know where the germ of an idea will come from, and sometimes it's from the most unexpected places.
Very good, outstanding. Well, I could ask you a lot more questions, but I'm not sure people's backs can take these chairs for a lot longer.
Is anybody squirming?
I'm actually doing a little squirming myself, as a matter of fact, but that's because I'm getting old. So anyway, we should wrap up tonight, but I just want to thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you all for having me and for being such a great audience. I appreciate it. Thank you.
As you can tell, Melissa, we are intensely proud of the Murrow name and the Murrow heritage, what it means to us as a college. And I have received no end of positive comments about your coming and being such a worthy recipient of the Murrow Award. So very, very appreciative of that.
Thank you.
So,
my only regret is that I'm not here during green season, which I understand is really quite extraordinary.
That's true.
But even the brown season of the blues is quite lovely.
Wow.
So invite me back in May. I think I can work it into my calendar.
We could be in 3.5 feet of snow or have hellacious winds blowing at 60 miles an hour. I think we've all experienced that as well. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Well, for those in the audience, thank you for joining us here this evening. We really genuinely appreciate your interest and involvement as support of Washington State University, and also your support of the Murrow College. In the words of Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.